Hey friends, it's Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Rachel Terry. I'm the author of 2 young adult fantasy books. Information will be in the description box down below if you're interested. Today's video is going to be a bit dark because we're going to be talking about Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann, which is the book that inspired the movie, and both of these things detail the Osage murders. So let's get right into that. The Osage are a tribe of American Indians, and the events of the Osage murders or Reign of Terror primarily took place in Osage County, Oklahoma during the 1920s. The Osage, like many tribes, were forced from their land multiple times by the U.S. government, eventually settling in Osage County, Oklahoma, because the land there was deemed to be rocky and unusable and worthless, and no white person would ever want to settle there. But that soon changed as well. The government decided that they were going to turn this land into allotments, meaning that white settlers could buy and settle there. The Osage had seen what happened to neighboring tribes' land when it became allotments, and they knew it was basically pointless to try to fight this. They were not going to be able to stop white settlers from buying and settling on this land. However, by some miracle, the Osage managed to sneak a provision into this agreement that said that the Osage would maintain control of the mineral rights or headrights. These could not be bought or sold, they had to be inherited. And when oil was discovered in Osage County, the main conflict of our story begins. Oil is an incredibly valuable resource even now, but even more so back then. White businessmen were paying the Osage incredible amounts of money in order to lease the land to drill for oil. The Osage had chauffeured vehicles, mansions, they even sent their children to be educated in Europe, which, as you can imagine, inspired no small amount of greed and even more jealousy. This story focuses on 4 main people: Molly Burkhart, an Osage Indian, Ernest Burkhart, her white husband, Brian Burkhart, Ernest's brother, and William Hale, their uncle. While the Osage were very wealthy because of this oil, they were not allowed to spend their own money because they had been deemed incompetent by the U.S. government, and so they had to have a guardian appointed to manage their finances for them. These guardians were inevitably white and did not always have the Osage's best interest in mind. In Molly's case, her husband Ernest was her guardian, and the story really begins when various members of Molly's family are killed, and it becomes clear that this is a murder. Her sister Anna is the first member of her family to be killed, followed by her mother, and her other sister is also killed later on as well. It's not only Molly's family that was affected by this. It becomes very clear early on that there is a conspiracy afoot. Someone is killing Osage Indians for their headrights because they cannot be bought and sold, they have to be inherited. And this created an environment of fear and suspicion, and just the sheer scope of this conspiracy is mind-boggling to me. And the corruption and injustice that took place as well is pretty disappointing. As I said in my previous video, people seem to think that the government is very corrupt right now and things are horrible and they are deteriorating from the way they used to be, but if you study history like this, you soon realize that it's always been this way. The justice system has always been broken, corrupt, easily influenced, and justice can be bought. And on the one hand, that's depressing because it means that it's always been that way and we're still that way now, and it might always be that way. But it's also reassuring in a sense to know that what we're experiencing now really isn't new. This book also details basically what was the birth of the FBI. The FBI used to be simply known as the BOI, or Bureau of Investigation, and it was headed by J. Edgar Hoover, who was kind of a quirky person and not the best person. I think he was pretty self-obsessed and not above breaking the law for his own benefit. He sends one of his agents, Tom White, and others down to Osage County to try to solve these murders and find out what was happening, because there had been investigations in the past that didn't go anywhere, private investigators that were hired by various families, and nothing came of it. And this reign of terror wasn't only affecting Osage, it was also affecting any ally that they may have had. The conspirators weren't above bumping off wealthy, influential white people if they got too close to the truth as well. One of these people was named McBride, and he went to Washington, D.C. to try to lobby for somebody to do something to investigate these murders. Someone from Oklahoma followed him there and killed him. But this is also part of why people knew it was a conspiracy. It wasn't just one single killer who was running around causing all of these murders. It was more than one person, and the fact that they engineered it so successfully is kind of amazing. I mean, you couldn't get away with something like this today just because word would get out somehow. But it's just kind of amazing that everybody who knew wasn't willing to talk. They were bought off, or I guess intimidated into silence, but a lot of people had to know who the murderers were, and they just, for whatever reason, did not come forward. Another victim was an attorney whose last name was Vaughn. He went to visit an Indian who was in the hospital dying of poisoning, and the Indian knew who his killer was. He said he had information to give to Vaughn. Vaughn also had information of his own, and he told his wife before he left where he had hidden this evidence, and that if anything should happen to him, she was to go there and take the evidence to the authorities. Needless to say, with evidence in his possession like that, of course, Vaughn never made it home. He was pushed from a train or killed and then thrown from the train, and his body was later found in a similar position as the man McBride, who traveled all the way to Washington and was killed there. So when Vaughn's wife went to get the evidence, it was not where Vaughn said it would be. So the only two options really are that his attackers managed to get the information out of him on the train, or he trusted his attackers enough to divulge where he kept this evidence and then they took it before it could be given to the authorities. So this was a very vast conspiracy. There were multiple killings that were committed with different methods. The first killings were gunshot victims. They were shot to death. You had lots of poisoning going on. Poisoning in general was pretty common in the 20s because with Prohibition, you had people making their own alcohol and it wasn't always safe to consume depending on what ingredients they used. So dying from consuming alcoholic beverages in the 20s wasn't all that unheard of, but somebody was purposefully spiking these people's drinks to poison them. Two victims, a husband and wife, were blown up in their house along with their servant, and the servant's body was never found, so they just assumed that she was absolutely blown to smithereens in this explosion. And I saw a picture in the book of what the house looked like before and what it looked like after, and I was just like, what in the world did they use to blow up this house? Because it was very effective, and I think it was nitroglycerin, but just the brutality of this. The descriptions at the time, notes from investigations say that they found pieces of the dead woman splattered 300 feet away on the side of a house, which is really nice detail. So that gives you kind of a glimpse of the ruthlessness that is at work here. Another instance is Molly Burkhart herself. She has diabetes, and her family always believed that because of this, she would be the one that dies first. In reality, she outlived all of her siblings and her mother. There were two doctors that were most likely in on this conspiracy, although their role was never concretely proved one way or another, who claimed that they were giving her insulin injections when in reality she was just getting sicker and sicker, and it's more likely that they were poisoning her rather than helping her diabetes as they claimed. One of the common methods for poisoning deaths was the perpetrators would purposely get an Indian drunk, take him to a doctor, the doctor would give him an injection of morphine, and then the doctor would leave the room, while then the perpetrators just gave this person a vast amount of morphine injections. The doctor would come back and say that the victim had died of alcohol poisoning, when in reality they'd been given an overdose of morphine. The official death toll for this reign of terror killings, I think, sits at 24, but it's more likely that it's in the hundreds. There are plenty of deaths that were never classified as nor investigated as homicides, and they were probably poisonings that were either never reported, the inquest was a sham. There were multiple instances in which guardians would not allow their poisoned ward to go to the hospital because they wanted them to die so that they can inherit the headrights. One guardian escaped with his ward's possessions and then lied to her and said that the money had ran out, so she was left to raise her two small children in poverty. And when the baby got sick, she pleaded with her guardian to send her money for medical treatments. He refused and the baby died. And there is just an abnormally high death rate among the Osage during this time, so not all of these deaths are natural. We know there's a conspiracy, but we know there's murders everywhere. And if you walk through the cemeteries, you will see an unusually high amount of young people who died during this time as well. The author of the book combed through lists of guardians and their wards, and a startlingly high number of the wards were listed as dead, and sometimes a guardian's entire group of wards would be dead, and this of course was all done to try to gain access to the headrights. So who is responsible for this? Well, because this is such a big thing, spanning even before the 20s and into the 30s, not all of the perpetrators were caught, obviously, just the ones of the longest running most successful, biggest conspiracy, and that was perpetrated by none other than William Hale and Ernest Burkhart. So Molly Burkhart's husband and his uncle and his brother were all in on this conspiracy. Depending on how you want to look at it, it seems that Ernest was more of an unwilling sort of participant in this, but he was so afraid of his uncle he was unable to say no. He did not kill anyone by himself, by his own hands, if I remember correctly, but he helped set it up. He helped recruit other criminals and arrange these things, and it was a very difficult case for the FBI to crack, but they eventually did. Ernest eventually admitted to what he had done, what his uncle had done, and then when threatened with repercussions from his uncle, kind of backtracked until his conscience finally drove him crazy to where he's like, no, I am guilty. This is the truth. It was an incredibly difficult case to prosecute because people were afraid of Hale. They were willing to be bought off by Hale. It was really ridiculous. But in the end, both Ernest Burkhart and William Hale were sentenced to different outcomes, really. Ernest Burkhart, because he didn't kill anybody himself, was sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. William Hale was deemed to have committed first-degree murder, and because it's in the first degree, that carries with it the death penalty, but his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, which was later cut even shorter when he was paroled, and Ernest Burkhart was also paroled. In another example of a miscarriage of justice, there were these two individuals who clobbered this woman over the head and then dumped her in a snake-infested swamp. The investigators found her in the bayou, and she was basically bits and pieces by that point. And it's gruesome. I can't even imagine what finding that must be like. But these people admitted to doing that. It was first-degree murder. They were sentenced to death, but then that was commuted to life imprisonment, and then 6 years later they were pardoned by the governor. So they basically got away with a slap on the wrist, and it really makes you question, what is a life worth? Apparently, not much. So there was lots of injustice carried out. Lots of people were never punished for what they did, and the Osage, to this day, the grandchildren of the people that were affected by this, are rightfully upset and disturbed by this because it was their families that were involved and affected by this, and there were many families that lost a family member. There were very few that were not affected by this personally at all. So many of the grandchildren had a grandparent that was murdered or affected by this in some way, and they still don't know who killed Grandpa, for example. And I feel like that's difficult. That would be a difficult thing to live with, and it would be even harder because so much time has gone by now that you really can't get the answers that you want. So the author in the end of the book did try his best to investigate this and give closure to the family, and in some cases this was more successful than others, but there's just so much information to be unpacked here, so much that we don't know. And even now, even as recently as 2014, the Osage were still being screwed over by the government. An Italian company came into their land and put up a bunch of wind farms, wind turbines, without their permission. The US government sued on their behalf, saying that because they had to dig to put the turbines in the ground, they were disturbing limestone and other things like that, which violated the Osage's mineral rights, but a judge basically dismissed the case, saying that they're not here to dig for these minerals, they're not disturbing you, they're not violating anything, so there's nothing you can do about it. And that just makes me angry. This whole case makes me angry with the corruption and the injustice of it all, and I think that's the point. It would make you angry reading about it, learning about it, but the fact that it's 2014 and this kind of stuff is still going on, it's like these people have suffered enough, leave them the hell alone. If they don't want these wind turbines on their land, get them off. That, and with the environmental regulations being increased, it's harder than ever to drill for oil, much less drill for oil profitably. So for the first time in basically 100 years, there was no new drilling for oil occurring in Osage County. Another thing that makes me mad about this whole thing is that in only a few short years, when the stock market crashed and the Great Depression happened, the money from the oil basically dried up. All of that wealth, it was gone. It evaporated. And partly this was probably due to the mismanagement of the finances by the Guardians, who were supposed to do anything but mismanage the finances. But all of that money was gone. And it's all like, what was this all for? What did they kill so many people for? I guess that's just kind of ironic in a way that they thought that this meant so much and that this would be here forever, and yet in just a short period of time it's gone. All of the boom towns that are mentioned in the book for the most part don't exist anymore. They're simply ruins or rubble or boarded up buildings, so it's just gone. And it's just crazy to me, the complexity of the conspiracy that Hale pulled off. And then the reason that all of this was done was because by killing off members of Molly Burkhart's family, Hale hoped to funnel their headrights to her because they were inherited, not bought. So she ended up with lots of her family members' headrights, which they then would hope to get to Ernest once Molly was out of the picture. And it gets really dark and creepy when it's basically all but proven that Ernest Burkhart only married Molly in the first place in order for Hale to then use him to enact this conspiracy. Ernest never really loved her. In fact, the sinister detail is revealed that the night that the house exploded with the husband and wife in it, I believe that was one of Molly's sisters in that house. She and her children were supposed to stay in that house that night, but because her son had a bad earache, they stayed behind. So that was really chilling, that Ernest not only helped put in place the conspiracy to blow up that house and kill the people inside, but he intended and knew that his wife and his children were supposed to be in that house at the same time as well. And just by this small detail, they were spared that. It's crazy to me. Happily, they did not succeed in their plot to kill Molly. Once all of this came out and she was removed from her husband's corrupting presence and the doctors that were giving her probably not insulin, she did improve and get better, and she eventually did divorce Ernest and she went on to remarry. That's kind of a bright spot, and otherwise a bleak picture. There's lots of other information in this book just about the sheer injustice that was done to these people. It's really disheartening, and it doesn't paint a really flattering picture of the US government, but it's also reassuring to learn these things. I just love learning about history, even the uglier, darker sides like this, and it's kind of reassuring to know that when things seem really bad right now, they're not that different than what they used to be. It's not any worse than it ever was. It's disheartening, on the other hand, to think that we've come so far and yet not really come far at all, but hopefully we can do better in the future. And I'm glad that this book was written. It's a masterful piece of investigative journalism and nonfiction, and I encourage people to read it to learn more. I'm glad that the movie is being made because it will bring more attention to this crime that's honestly very much a shameful part of American history, and that was basically all but forgotten and covered up. I mean, just a short time, just a few decades after these crimes were committed, they were all but forgotten, and I certainly never learned about it in school. So there you have it. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. I appreciate each and every one of you. My name is Rachel Terry. I am the author of 2 young adult fantasy books, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!